Welcome to Grief Uprooted, a podcast dedicated to sharing your grief stories. Together, we embark on the mystery of one's grief journey as they learn to live, heal, and be courageous in a world rooted in trauma. Join myself, Christine, in an open discussion to help you uproot the grief in all our lives. I am an award winning author, professional speaker, and humanitarian in the field of grief and trauma. I want you to be part of the discussion. Today, I want to welcome Jason Tuttle, the author of Letters to Zachary. Jason is an avid blogger on the topic of men and grief. His mission to help men with their grief is making waves. He draws his inspiration from being a stay-at-home dad for 12 years to two special needs children, one whom he held while they took their last breath in the hospital. I can't thank you enough, Jason, for joining us today and really diving into a topic that I know a lot of my listeners and audience, and I know you're all listening, really want to talk about, but it's really, really, really hard to find that man who will step up to be vulnerable enough and to talk about this heavy stuff. So I really want to start with where you're tuning in or where you're coming from and where you presently live and what your life was like kind of before grief stepped into it.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. I really appreciate being on.
Mm.
I am in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm actually in one of the metropolitan counties of Atlanta, Georgia.
Mm.
For those that live in the South around me, the Atlanta basically takes up all of North Georgia. We're like 18 or 19 metro counties that are considered Atlanta.
Ah.
And so it's like 150 miles across or something ridiculous. Um, I am in the southern US. Life for us before grief hit was, you know, I met my wife. This was before it was popular. I met my wife actually online.
Oh.
Um, we met online in a Yahoo chat room of all things years ago. And at the time, I was working a job where I had like Wednesday, Thursday off. I was working at the airport here in Atlanta, and
Nice.
our paths happened to cross. We met that evening, and a year to the day, I proposed to her, and
Mm.
we got married. And about a year after that, we decided that we wanted to have a family. And
Mm.
so my wife is from the Northeast, up in kind of the Massachusetts, Connecticut area,
Mm-hmm.
up there. And so, as you can imagine, she's well, at least at that time was a cradle Catholic. She wanted a large family. Um, her her first comment to me was, I think I want to have four kids. And I looked at her and went, let's have the first one and then let's talk. I mean, I always wanted to have a family, four
Mm.
kids at that point. I was just like, I don't know if I want four, but I at least want one and we'll go from there. So she got pregnant. We had no reason to believe that anything was going to happen. We had no like physical disabilities or anything in our family.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing that wasn't self-induced, if you will.
I got it.
Nothing that was like genetic or passed down in
Yeah.
our family. So she gets pregnant about the week 20 appointment. That's the appointment where you find out the sex of the child that everybody
Mm.
looks forward to. And so she didn't want to know because as a lot of women say, well, that's life's last great surprise.
Yeah.
And I wanted to know just because I'm a planner, I'm the one that painted the nursery and put
Yeah.
all that together. And it came down to I didn't want to do yellows and greens just because those aren't my favorite colors. And so, we got into the ultrasound appointment, and she said the tech started doing her thing. And she gets to that point. She said, do you want to know the sex of the child? And we playfully banter back and forth. And before we can finish an answer, she goes, I found an issue. I need to know the sex of the child. And so
Oh.
we go, okay, we want to know the sex. You're having a boy. And honestly, the next question, as I've learned later on years down there, she probably shouldn't have answered, but she did.
Mm.
And I went, "Why do you need to know the sex of the child?" And her comment was, "Well, if it's what I think it is," she said, "it's rare in boys, but even rarer in girls." And I
Mm.
said, "Can you tell us what that is?" And she said, "No, the doctor needs to tell you that, as in today's world because of a liability issue."
Mm.
And so from that point forward, we went to a perinatologist, which for those that don't know is kind of a
Yeah,
high
what's that?
risk OBGYN, if you will. And I don't want to say snowballed from there, but at least from our perspective in the moment with everything that was being thrown our way, it kind of felt like it was snowballing from there.
Yeah.
So we get through the next several weeks. My wife has our son. We get to see him for about a minute. She doesn't really get to see him because she had a C-section, and like the epidural kind of made her feel unwell, as
Yeah.
it does for a lot of women. And so from that point forward, he went up to the NICU at the hospital. Um, After I left the delivery room and she went into recovery, I went up to the NICU at that hospital, and it was the doctor that said, "Your son has been born with a rare condition called Eagle-Barrett syndrome, or it's more affectionately known as prune belly."
Hmm.
It's 1 in 40,000 births. They still don't know what officially causes it. They know a lot of the characteristics about it. Um, and so the easiest way to describe it was, normally you're born with abdominal muscles, to get the six pack abs and all that.
Yeah.
My son had none of those. He had
Okay.
no core muscles. He had an abnormally large bladder that needed to be cathed every 4 hours, at least in his early part of his life. He didn't get the sensation in the beginning of his life to like actually have to go.
Mm-hmm.
If I didn't fully drain his bladder, he was susceptible to urinary tract infections. On the other side, and not to get too graphic, I had to
Mm-hmm.
give him Miralax to kind of get that going because otherwise he would get impacted on
Yeah.
that side. He had he breathed normally, but he had a diminished lung capacity, meaning when you or I get like a pneumonia style illness,
Mm-hmm.
we have the force to cough it out. He did not.
Mm.
So we found out very early on that if I didn't catch it fast enough, we were going to be admitted to the hospital. And so after about the third or fourth time, we finally got a pulmonologist, and I literally got 5 or 6 respiratory machines in my house that I was trained on how to use. So from that point forward, I I had my protocol. I had a Hillron vest machine that beat his chest to get the mucus free. I had a encephalator that blew air in and sucked it out so it'd bring it up his esophagus. I had a suction machine to get it out of the back of his throat. I had a nebulizer to give him breathing treatments and something else, but I don't remember what. There was another machine that I had. So every time he got sick and I heard that cough in my ear that I knew what it was, I started that. And if I didn't get to it, I took him to the hospital. We were almost inevitably admitted every time we went there just because he just had a hard time getting rid of it. Outside of the Eagle-Barrett syndrome, he was born with severe delays, meaning
Mm.
when he passed away, he was 15, but he functioned about 4 to 6 years old. He had epilepsy, which he had seizures. He
Mm-hmm.
was nonverbal, and he did walk, but it was assisted. So he was basically wheelchair bound,
Mm-hmm.
is all of his issues. And then his sister, as a side note, was born with all of his issues except for the rare condition. So within 2 years, almost to the day, I had 2 kids with 6 issues that were all identical except for the rare condition.
So I'm gonna back you up.
Yep.
Um, First off, I'm gonna tell you why I love men.
Hmm.
Um, because I have worked in this industry for 24 years,
Hmm.
mainly focused in men in grief and
Hmm.
running programs and things like that. But when I hear you speak,
Hmm.
it it literally is like Captain America. I'm
Hmm.
coming to save you. And I hear
Yeah.
you like, I got this machine, I got this done, I got this done, I got this done. That ultimately is the beauty of men. They is I guess I want to say this lightly, that those emotions that you're feeling, and I can see them in you, are put to work. It's like, I have to save this family. This is what we're going to do. It's admirable. It really is. Um,
Yeah, I mean, societally speaking, men are taught from birth that we are
mhm,
problem solvers.
yes.
It's like when there have been times in our marriage when my wife has asked if, even though if I feel like my world is crashing around me, she'll go, "How are you doing?" And the standard male response is, "I'm fine. I'll figure out a way."
Yep.
We're naturally problem solvers, and it's one of the reasons why men and women argue so much is because my wife will want to just vent to me, and I'll want to give her solutions to it.
Yep.
It's just in the DNA. It's nothing
Yep.
personal. It's
Yep.
just that's what I've
And
grown
I
up.
and I think seeing the value of that in the opposite sex, like that is the one thing, especially with working with military men and things like that. I see that and that protection of family and everything. And I just wanted to acknowledge that because as a woman, that makes me feel safe that,
Mhm.
and I know women can do that and men can do that and all our roles switch and change. I know you're all listening to me right now and saying this, but it is just nice, and that is a gift. I feel like men do have that protection thing. But I want to bring you back to, you mentioned your daughter being born. So your son is born here. What was his life expectancy? Did they tell you this?
Through Eagle Barrett syndrome or prune belly, there were three classifications. They either did not make it from birth,
Mm-hmm.
that either were born at birth and then didn't make it. They only made it to 2 or 3 years old, and then there was everybody else.
Okay.
Um, One of the things I didn't mention about the prune belly syndrome that he had was typically a lot of those kids are born with one kidney, which my son was. That one
Mm-hmm.
kidney is damaged in utero before being born. So the question is how much good kidney do they have to sustain normal function the bigger they get to adulthood?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot of kids that have Eagle Barrett syndrome that have massive kidney issues, like needing transplant kind of issues.
Mm-hmm.
And so despite the outcome of what life brought us with our son, and everything else, we never had a kidney issue. As of his last ultrasound before everything happened, his kidney was perfectly fine.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I tell people from a religious aspect, I say, God's given me all this other stuff. He's got to give me a win somewhere else.
That was your win. And so
Mm.
then you decided to get pregnant again and have another child. And this was 2 years later?
Yeah, it was well, she was born about almost 2 years to the day after my son. So my son was born, we'd had him for about a year, and then at that point we decided we want to have another. And let me tell you the flack we got.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
I can imagine.
Flack in the sense of a lot of families said, "Well, you've got a child with all these issues. Why would you want to have another child?" And before we decided to do that, I'm a researcher. And so I asked multiple people in like the prune belly community and said, if you've had more than one child, is it possible for your next child to get this condition? And 98% said the reality is no, they won't happen. Does it happen occasionally? Yes, it does. But the reality is 98% of their 99% of the time your next child will not have this issue. And so, with that information, and plus, we always knew we wanted our son not to be an only child and to have
Mm-hmm.
a playmate, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
and to have a sibling. And so, despite what other people said, we muscled forward.
Good for you. And so when you went to the ultrasound, did they tell you this baby will have it too? Or,
What my daughter,
yeah.
let me tell you the story about that ultrasound. So we started off seeing the perinatalogist for our daughter because of the
Yes.
history with our son. So we go in there. We at this point we had already known the sex of the child because of everything that happened with our son. We said we just want to know.
Yeah.
You know, we already know the sex of our and son. Plus, honestly, we laughed about it because after we found out the sex of our daughter, my mother goes, "Were you going to have another one?" And I went. In 2 tries, we had a boy and a girl. We have hit the proverbial pregnancy
Yep, that's
jackpot.
right.
We're not having anymore.
That's right.
And at that point, we had no belief that she was going to have any issues. But we get to like the week, it's like 26 or 27 appointment, and they're doing the ultrasound, and the tech, and again, another tech goes, huh? And I go, what does huh mean? That never sounds good.
Good.
And she goes, well, it looks like there's fluid forming on the left lung. And I said,
Mm,
okay, so what does this mean? What's the severity of it?
mm,
All those questions. And she goes, well, it's not good. She said, because she goes, I can't tell where it's coming from. And she goes, what will happen is the weight of that pressure will stunt the growth of the lung, which is a major issue.
yeah.
And I said, so what do we need to do? She said, I would recommend an amnio.
Mm,
And up until that point, I was very anti-amnio.
yeah, me too.
Not for the procedure itself, it's just because everything I had read said even though they get the fluid out of there and they can
Hmm.
test it, it's only probabilities. It's not certainty
Yeah.
of what's going to happen. It's things that could happen.
Hmm.
And so plus, for those that aren't familiar with kind of the biology of it, your child's essentially in a balloon inside the woman.
Yeah.
And the amnio punctures a hole in that balloon and it will basically stay together without like rupturing. But at any point after that, if a jar, a wrong move,
Yeah.
if it ruptures, the water breaks, your wife goes into labor at any point from, and I was very at least initially anti that. So I said, okay, how long do we have to decide? And she goes, well, you don't have to do it today, but sooner rather than later. And I went, can we tell you that our next appointment was literally the next week? And she
Yeah.
said, yes, that's fine. And so I go, well, how are y'all going to do this?
Yeah.
And she said, we're going to take a very long needle. We're going to go in through the stomach, into the sac, into the child's chest, into the lung area where the water
Woo.
is. And I went, so y'all are going to be basically, pinpointing a spot to a child that's moving inside hers
Yeah, that's
to
not going
get
to
to
stay
the,
still.
it's not. And I went, I mean, this was a lot to take in.
Yeah.
And so I said, okay. And so we went home and like I said, we're religious. And so we prayed about it. And I went back and forth and back and forth. And so finally I just looked at my wife and I said, as much as I don't want to do it and the risk of it, I said, with the fact that this is forming out of the blue,
Yeah.
I said, we've got to find an answer. I said, because we've already got a child that's got major issues. We don't want her to have even more major issues on top of this.
Yeah.
So we decide yes, we go into the appointment. Doc comes in, does thing, and he goes, huh? And I went, every time we come in, you make that sound.
Yeah.
And he goes, I told you there was a fluid on the left lung, didn't I? I said, yeah, you told us we were going to have to do an amnio in the process in which we were going to have to go and do it. And I said, which concerns me. And he looks and he looks and he looks and he goes, well, I don't see it anywhere. He said, I wrote it in my notes that you had, and he said, it is completely gone. It has disappeared. He said, everything looks normal. Everything looks fine. He was just like, at this point, we have no reason to do it. He's just like, that is the weirdest thing. And I didn't say it to him, but I kind of have a feeling I know how it went away, just
Amen.
based on my religious beliefs,
Yeah, exactly.
but I mean, I didn't say it to him. And
Yeah.
so, from that point forward, we had no reason. Even when she was born,
Ah.
we had no re. It was 6 months in. We had an OT coming to the house and her intern coming to the house for our son. The OT goes, "Can we do the Peabody Skills Assessment test on your daughter?" Which, for those that don't know, is basically gives you an age range of all their beginning functioning that
Hmm.
they do. It's a pretty long test, and it kind of tells where they are on the scale based on their age and if they're delayed or not.
Yeah.
And if I were to pay out for that, I looked right there and went, I know what that test costs. If you want to give me a free one, go for
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
And so they did, and they came back, and the intern goes, well, we believe that your daughter's delayed.
Mm.
And I will admit, as a man, I did not want to hear because that was a lot to hear at that moment, 6 months in. And my exact words, and I won't repeat all of it because it was expletive laden. I went, pack up your S and get out of my house.
Yeah.
literally like that. I mean, I wasn't having it. And so we went to our pediatrician and who has a special needs child. And she goes, I tend to agree with her. You may want to go see a neurologist. And and so we told the neurologist this, and I'll never forget it. She goes, if you're basing your daughter's functioning ability on your son, she's going to seem normal. But in reality, based on a
Yep.
normal child of that age,
Yeah.
she is delayed. And from that point forward, again, it kind of snowballed, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
And we found out about all of her issues and just everything. And so 2 years into having children, we had two kids with multiple issues, some rare,
Mm-hmm.
seeing six specialists every 6 months. I decided to become a stay-at-home parent, and
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it went from there.
And I want to back up to that point where you talk about, because that's, I think, tackling the hard things other people say to us or our
Mhm,
expectation. Like, I got pregnant at 40.
mhm,
I had two healthy children, teenagers, and I decided to have another child at 40.
mhm.
I was gonna punch people in the face. I say that kindly. I
Yep.
did not ask for your opinion.
Yep.
And it was like, why are you being greedy? And I had one lady that didn't even know me. I was getting my nails done. And
Mhm,
she saw me pregnant. And I was like, well, I would like two, because then, and no one knew my life story. My life story was I worked in deployment. I got deployed and didn't
mhm,
have that chance to have more children. And she was like, why are you doing this to your child? You're going to be dead by the time they get married or they have children. And I was like, are you kidding me? And as a
mhm,
woman, I was sitting there, and I hate to say it, I went to my emotions, right? And I'm like, oh,
mhm,
what am I going to do? And then when I thought about it, I thought, I'm angry at you. How dare you give me your opinion when
mhm,
I did not ask? So I'm curious how you felt with, here we were going to go and have another child, and
mhm,
people like, start me there. Like, how did you feel when people are like, why? I remember once somebody saying to me, you have children because you want them. Of
yep.
course it's for you. Of course it's self-centered. Of course it's because you want to love something and you want
Mhm,
to make something with somebody you love. There's nothing
mhm.
wrong with that. So how did you take people kind of saying like you're crazy to kind of do this again?
Um, I have always been kind of outspoken.
I love
I
it.
have. Um, I never said it to the actual relatives
Mm,
just because I didn't want to go down that road. It's
yeah.
their opinion, no matter how much I disagreed with it or disliked it. I didn't want to create that rip, but like in talking to my wife at the time, I was just like, it's not their decision, it's our decision. And to kind of circle back, when my wife revealed to me she was pregnant with our son, we were over the moon about it before we knew everything. And then her comment to me, I'll never forget it. We were sitting in our old house in the kitchen, and she goes, well, what if we have a child with medical needs? And my response was, well, if we have a child with medical needs, we're meant to have a child with medical needs.
Mm-hmm.
And we got two
Yeah.
with a lot of issues. And so since then, I've always joked, someone upstairs heard me and granted that wish. And so, y- at least in the beginning, in dealing with all these issues and things like that, I've been outspoken, but I was a little more timid about it. And
Yeah.
in life, there's a learning curve in a lot of
Yep.
things. And there's a building up of the thick skin,
Mm-hmm.
but quickly that thick skin got really thick and callous because I was just like, it's not your decision, it's our family.
Mm-hmm.
You know, for lack of better ways to say it, is what we say in the South. I'm a grown ass adult. I can make my own. I can make my own decisions.
Yep.
And so that's kind of the outlook I had on it. I was just like, you don't have to like it. You don't have to deal with it. It's my decision.
Exactly. And what I tend to do is say, look at where the message is coming from.
Mhm.
And what I mean by that, I'm not being an asshole, is some people have not experienced grief. So
Yeah.
I have not walked in your shoes. I don't know
Mhm.
what it's like to be there and have a child with so many special needs.
Mhm.
You do. And
Mhm.
so you're basing your decision on your life experiences. And
Mhm.
so many times people are giving their opinion based on their life experiences.
Mhm.
So we have no idea what happened to them. And it might have been horrific. Maybe they had a sibling that was disabled. There could be so many different things. But that's
Hmm.
where you have to say, just have some compassion and empathy for somebody else.
Hmm.
Um, so then we decide to be a stay-at-home dad. I want to know how
Yep.
society took that one.
Well, it was always kind of decided between my wife and I
Hmm.
that I was going to stay home because of two or three reasons. One, my degree down here in the States is in education. I taught
Mm.
elementary school physical education for 9 years.
Wow.
I absolutely love dealing with the younger kids, and I have been told for years, especially when I was younger, that I was always really good with kids.
Yeah.
And so when my wife and I met and we dated and got married and all that, I said, well, I said, if we can afford it, do you want to stay at home or,
Hmm.
do you want me to? And my wife has always kind of liked to work and be out of the house, and I'm just like, I'm okay with that. And
Hmm.
and so when we initially had our son, I was still teaching. It was actually one of the parents of one of my students who was a stay-at-home mother of like six or something like that.
She did the Catholic thing.
Yeah, that actually lived in a neighborhood literally right next to the school that I was at, and I mean, I paid her to watch him
Mm.
at least in those first couple of months, so I wouldn't have to go to a daycare and risk
Yep.
getting sick all the time, and especially with his needs,
Yep.
that kind of stuff. And so we did that for a while, and then the last school I was at in the county that I was working in, that I started in that year. I was in and out of the school so much, like going in back and forth to the hospital because of hospital stays and things like
Hmm.
that, that it got to the point I'd burned through all my sick time, all my personal time. I was essentially working for free.
Yeah.
And as much as I hate to say it, I had so much stress going on
Hmm.
that it was starting to kind of show at work.
Yeah.
And I mean, I told my wife, I said, the emotion and the stress has to come out somewhere. And I
Exactly.
said, I refuse to let it come out at home. And the only other place is work.
Hmm.
And so, about December, January of that school year, I went up to the principal and just said, I knew the answer I was going to ask her, but I was more asking her because I want to see her response.
Hmm.
Typically in education, at least in the US, if you sign a contract and leave out in the middle of a contract, no matter how noble the issue is, you're essentially blackballed.
Yep.
It's They'll tell you no,
Hmm.
but the reality is I broke a contract, no matter what the reason is for. So I asked her, I said, if I leave out, say in January, am I going to get blackballed from the county? Oh, no, 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 gave me the principal answer. And in my head, I'm thinking,
Yeah.
that's a bunch of garbage.
Yeah.
Stop lying to me. And so she said, well, how much time are you going to need? At that point in time, I think it was Wednesday or Thursday of that week. I said, uh, I talked to my wife because in the gym I worked in, I had an outside line. So I called my wife on one of my breaks and I said, what are your thoughts on this? And, like everybody says, you're never really prepared for it. You just got to kind of rip the band-aid off and
Yeah.
go for it. And so I'm one of those people when I make a decision of what I want, there's no looking back.
Yeah.
And so we had decided that. And so literally that Friday morning, I think it was. I shouldn't have done it this way, but it's how it turned out. I took a white piece of paper and in black Sharpie, I wrote, "Dear, the principal," I
Yeah.
said, I've decided I'm resigning effective immediately on this day at the end of
Hmm.
the school day, something to that effect. And I put it on her desk and I walked back to do my job that day.
We interrupt this podcast for a dirty moment.
Honestly, the things that trigger me are moments, meaning there are songs that I come across that I listen to that remind me of my son. One specifically is the former lead singer of Creed, Scott Stapp, has a solo career, and he made a song called "Gone Too Soon" that was actually for Chester Bennington, the former lead singer of Linkin Park that passed away.
Mm.
That it's not exactly about the scenario that we've dealt with, but it's still about grief and dying. And when I hear that, that typically gives me a punch to the gut when I hear it. Honestly, the triggers I have are just the most random things. I can't really pinpoint them. I mean, it can be anything as just things that I feel like I should have a little bit of control of that I've lost control of,
Mm.
or random people, and I hear comments about getting upset about things with their kids or complaining about just things that I find that are just, why are you complaining about? That's ridiculous. Is those type of things that trigger me throughout the day, that it's got nothing to do with grief or related to grief, but on a subconscious level for me, it kind of finds its way back to that, because I'm just like, with my perspective change, I'm just like, of all the things that you could be upset about, that's the least of your concerns.
Mm.
And, I've had a major shift in my life. And so the things I value now are vastly different than what they were before everything happened. And because of where I was in the building, I had a radio on me, and I laughed because I got about midday, I got a phone call, Mr. Tuttle. And I said, yes, ma'am.
Mhm.
And she was just like, can you come up to my office at the end of the day? And I said, and what would this be regarding? Because I knew what it was. And she was just like, you know what this is regarding.
Yeah.
And so I went in there and I said, so are you surprised? And she goes, well, I'm not really surprised. But she said, I'm kind of surprised at the speed in which you're doing it. And
Mm.
she said, "Are you sure you don't need another week?" And I went, no, I'm good. I
Yeah.
said, in fact, I will have all of my stuff in a box in my truck driving out of this parking lot while you're still sitting at your desk in your office as I drive out.
Hmm.
And I said, I will be gone before you are today. And I'll never forget, I looked into her office window and she was still sitting there as I was driving out. And so, but yeah, it was always me. And then, because what it turned out to be was, I did all the physical medical procedures, and the bigger
Hmm.
they got, I had the size to be able to lift them
Yeah.
and to move them around. And so it worked out better that I stayed at home, just because I had the strength,
Hmm.
especially when they got in their teenage years, and like my daughter's still in her teenage years.
Hmm.
And so that's just kind of how it came about. As for the stereotypes, um, I didn't have a ton. Now, when I became a stay-at-home parent, it was 2010 or 12,
Oh, so we
something
were,
like that.
that's pretty good. Then,
And so it was starting to where men were
yeah.
doing it at that point. It's a
Yeah.
lot more popular now for
Yes.
men to do it. And so the biggest issues I ran into were like situations that were typically always the mother that did it. The
Hmm.
people you were responding to were women, because
Yeah.
like talking to teachers,
Hmm.
they didn't know how to handle me,
Hmm.
because I'm generally agreeable, but when you're going against something that I feel like my child should need, or something that I feel like is right, you know, I can look intimidating from what people tell me.
Yep.
And I mean, I can get stern real quick. And so
Yeah.
they really didn't know how to handle that. Like
Yeah.
it was so foreign to them that a father was as involved as what I was at that point,
Hmm.
in just everything related to him, even going into the hospital.
Hmm.
I had nurses, I can't tell you how many times, said, you were the most informed parent I've ever come across.
Yeah.
And I said, well, my son is nonverbal, and I've got 15 years worth of medical knowledge in my head that you need to hear about should you need it
Hmm.
to better take care of him.
And I
And
think that's
so
the,
it was more kind of the traditional stereotypes. They just didn't know how to handle it.
yeah. And I was like, um, and just to take you back to walking out on your job,
Mhm.
I have worked with men who have just got up and
Mhm.
left. And I'm
Yep.
like, whoa, whoa, whoa. And I'm chasing after him. I'm like, what are we doing? I'm done. I'm done. And I'm like,
Yep.
we're not going to talk about it anymore? Nope, done. I'm like,
Yep.
okay, so like, this is it. We're doing it. Holy
Yep.
shit. Right. And I'm just like,
Yep.
okay, I'm ready. And I had to very quickly learn that's what happens. They
Yep.
all this stuff is happening in the mind, and you may
Yep.
not be hearing it um
Yep.
from a man, and then all of a sudden, boom. And I'm like, we're
Yep.
heading in the right, like we're doing it. And it's right or
Yeah.
wrong. They've made a decision and that's where they're going. And then when it comes to society and listening to you talk about, well, they didn't know how to handle you. That's because traditionally mom went in, and if mom wasn't heard, we brought dad in. Because
Yep.
then dad, he was a man and they don't talk that much. And so,
Yeah.
if the dad comes in, well, and I remember doing that with my own children, saying to my husband,
Yep.
this lady, I just don't think she understands me. And I said, well, come in with me. And it was funny because I was like, wow, they're so nice. And I'm
Yep.
like, I don't want to believe this is happening, but it is true.
Mhm.
It's kind of your package, right? You're a man. And
And now to give you some understanding, I'm 6 foot 230.
yeah,
So
so
I'm not a tiny person. And I have all my life, my general demeanor, I've just always had a serious demeanor when I'm not talking.
yes.
And so I have had so many people in so many jobs say, well, you always look pissed off. And I'm just like, I'm not, it's just my face. I mean, I can't, I have always been
Been
when I'm really focused, I have on something, I'm laser focused on it. I just have this stern look because I'm thinking about what I'm doing.
yes.
And so I have gotten that on. So when I walk into somewhere and I'm just looking at some, I guess I give off this vibe of
Of
just I'm walking in the door already upset. And I joke with my wife when she said it to me, and I'm just like, well, sometimes that gets rid of the undesirables right from the start, and
hmm
that actually helps me because I don't have to deal with you.
Yep. That's exactly. My mother coined her face because people always said she looked pissed off. She goes, I have resting bitch face. And I'm
Yep.
like, resting bitch face? And she's
Yep.
like, yeah, apparently when I rest my face, I must look like this. And then
Hmm.
I laughed and I thought, oh, that's funny. That's just, but it is. People are drawing, they're looking and drawing conclusions,
Yep.
and they're not really diving in. So, take me through the death of Zachary, how that came about, and really you have this underlying foundation of all these things you've been dealing with, and
Yep.
now comes the time that your son dies. How old was he when he died?
He had turned 15. He was 15 for
Wow,
about 2 months.
made it a far way.
So, I mean, in the grand scheme of thing, I mean, he had 15 years alive, but in the
Yeah.
grand scheme of thing, it was cut very short.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so, well, the side note to all of this is I personally have dealt with depression for 21 years. I've
Mm-hmm.
dealt with anxiety, and I just recently got diagnosed with ADD at 45 years old, two
Yep.
years ago. And so not only do I have all of his issues to deal with and my daughter's issues, I have my own personal issues
Yes.
that I have to navigate through all of this.
Yep.
And so, but let's see if I can give the shortened version of it. So about 3 days before everything happened, my typical routine was the but because my kids are in a wheelchair bus, the bus literally stops in front of my house and they get bused to the school that most appropriately meets their needs, which may not be where they're zoned for.
Mm-hmm.
And so they would come home and get them both off the bus. And depending on if it was bath night or not, I'd get them out of their chairs. I'd kind of get them in their lounge clothes that they would come in at the house just so they get out of their school clothes. I do kind of give them drinks and snacks and all that kind of stuff and just kind of start the routine. And what would happen is typically about 7:30 every night, we put my daughter to bed just because if I did, she's very routine oriented. And if I don't, she'll give me just garbage for it. You'd be amazed at how much a nonverbal child can really talk when you're not doing her routine. And so I would put her to bed, and then my son, I would bring him into my wife and my bedroom,
Mm-hmm.
and we would spend about another hour with him just to give him some one-on-one time because I love my daughter, but she's a handful. And there would be some nights you could see it in my son's eyes. He'd be just like, "Can you just put her to bed?"
Good girl.
Yeah. So about 3 days before, I had made one of his favorite meals, And even though he almost looked anorexic, but like I fed him like a horse, and he just could not keep weight on.
Mm.
And so that night I made him one of his favorite, and he just ate a ton of it, which was fine. That was normal. So we bring him into our room. We spend time with him. And it gets to be about time of him to go to bed. My wife goes to brush his teeth. We use an electric toothbrush because of his sensory issues, he liked the vibrations in his mouth, and so we would do that. And so she went to go get the back teeth, and at the she went a little too far, and he kind of gagged and threw up a little bit, and it didn't really surprise us. We were just like, well, maybe you hit the gag reflex, and just something came up. Just kind of over our head, thought that's a normal reaction. Put him to bed. Well, that night he was up and down all night long,
Mm.
which is unusual for him. And I was staying at home at that point. And so when we got up the next morning, I said, I'm going to text his teacher because he was in a self-contained classroom. And if it
Mm.
was a virus,
Yeah.
I didn't want to spread it to everybody in that room with all medical issues.
Yeah.
So I text her and go, hey, I'm keeping Zachary home. I think he's caught something. I'm not sure what it is. I just don't want to spread it. And she's like, okay, we'll see you tomorrow. They were really good about it. Well, that next day, we get him and her up, and we send my daughter off to school because they were in the same classroom.
Mm.
And he absolutely refused to take a nap. And I kept telling him all day, I'm just like, buddy, you're not missing anything. You see that couch over there? I'm gonna be sitting on it with my laptop. That's all
Yeah.
you're gonna be seeing me doing
Yeah.
today. And so he wouldn't go. He wouldn't. It was like he was felt like he was gonna miss something.
Yeah.
And so we get through the day, he drinks a little bit, doesn't eat a whole lot, and that kind of catches my attention. So I think, well, maybe he's got a 24-hour bug. He's caught many of them throughout his life. I thought we've just got to muscle through this
Mm-hmm.
and he'll be better on the other side. And so I text the teacher again, and because we're butting up kind of to it was like a teacher work day or something going on, like a holiday that we were going to have. And so my thought process was, I'll keep him out tomorrow. We'll butt up to these days off. We'll have the weekend, and then by the time he should be over whatever this is.
Yeah.
And so that night, instead of keeping him up, we put him to bed the same time as our daughter to give him an extra hour sleep, and he gets quiet instantly. And
Mm.
at that point, we think, well, he's just exhausted. He didn't sleep well the night before. He didn't nap anytime during the day. He's got to be exhausted. So I decide on a whim. I tell my wife, and in hindsight, I'm glad I did. I said, you know what? I'm gonna keep him home one more day. I said something's just not right.
Mm-hmm.
I said I'll give him another day to recover, and then he'll have the off days and the weekend, and then it'll just be better for everybody. And so we get up, get my daughter to school, and about 8:30 that morning we walk into his room and he's there and he's slowly moving, nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Normally he's bouncing when we get in there, like bouncing in his bed.
Yeah.
He's not doing that. And so I'm thinking, well, he's probably still not feeling well. And I walk around to his right side and I notice this dark green streak coming out of his mouth.
Yeah.
Well, the only thing in the human body I know that's dark green that would come out of your body is bile.
Yeah. Your stomach.
And I look at that and I go, why is bile coming out of his mouth?
Yeah.
And because my son was nonverbal, but we had this kind of connection where I could read him really
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
And I could tell things that maybe others couldn't. And and my first instinct was, this isn't good. I said, anytime bile is involved, something big's going on.
Mm-hmm.
So I get him out of his bed and he's kind of floppy, which that didn't really strike me because we've had times where he was really sick, where we went to the hospital, where he was kind of in the same state and kind of lethargic.
Mm-hmm.
And so I thought, this isn't good. So I bring him out in the living room and I go through my protocol of what I'm doing for like of his other issues. And I give him a catheter and for his abnormally large bladder, the amount of fluid might have been a lot for a normal person, but for him was minimal.
Yeah.
And so I did all my kind of my checklist, and he still just the one thing that struck me was his midsection was rock hard, like cinder block wall rock hard, and that threw me off. I was just like, there's been times it's been tight, but it hasn't been rock hard.
Yeah.
And I look at it and went, that's unusual. I don't know what's going on. And it was honestly just a whim.
Mm-hmm.
I went, I think I'm going to take him up to the hospital. I said, something's not right. I don't know what's going on. And I said, I really think I need to take him up to the ER. Now in Atlanta, for those that are in the Georgia Atlanta area, I'm on the southwest side of Atlanta. The hospital that we go to that's a part of Children's Healthcare of Atlanta is about 60 miles north of us,
Mm,
which sounds like a lot, but I've driven that drive so I can do it blindfolded.
yeah.
And so I get my son in his chair, get him in the van, and as I'm driving off, because my wife is working at home at the time. I said, I'm gonna take him up to the hospital. If worst comes to worst, we'll probably get admitted. We'll be there a couple of days. We'll come home.
Yeah.
And so I call my mother's. I'm driving up. I say the same thing. She goes, okay, well, just let me know because there's several stories where I've literally caught things right as they're forming and
Yeah.
brought him into the hospital. And the doctors have said, you couldn't have brought him here any earlier.
Mhm.
And so I get on the interstate and I'm doing like 90 going up there. I mean, I'm flooring it getting
Yeah.
up there. And so I get into Atlanta and I get kind of on the north side. And anybody that's been in Atlanta, especially the time that I drove up there, know that Atlanta traffic is ridiculously bad.
Yeah.
So we get up there and I get on the interstate that goes towards where I need to get to this hospital. And about 1,000 yards before the exit, I see the interstate sign and it says major wreck, all lanes blocked.
Oh
And I
God.
went, oh.
Yeah. But you're still
And in my
feeling somewhat positive that you've caught something and you're thinking, I've caught it.
well, for my son, I'm keeping my demeanor down, but in
Yes.
my head, I'm freaking out because
Okay. That's
the
where I
the
want to.
whole way up, he's kind of fading in and out like he wants to fall asleep, and so
Yeah.
I don't know what's going on. And like a concussion, you don't want to fall asleep right after you have
Yeah.
one because it will
Exactly.
create more issues. And
Yes.
so the whole way up, I'm snapping my fingers and looking him in the rearview mirror, going, "Buddy, stay with me, stay with me.
Hmm.
Daddy's getting you to the hospital." And so I get stuck in this traffic and we're crawling for about 15 minutes and I'm just freaking out in my head thinking, what is going on? So I finally get to the front and I don't know if they're letting us go or not, but I see daylight and I floor it.
Hmm.
Now, in my rearview mirror, I see the like DOT worker swearing at me. I don't know if he'd let me go, but I mean, he didn't know what was going on in my
Yeah.
van.
That's right. That's right.
So we get up to the hospital. I get him out of the van, and he's really floppy, like to the point it's beyond what I've ever experienced. And I'm like, this really isn't good.
Good.
So I get up in the ER, and I like skip the line, and the security guard that's standing there gets up to come up to me as if to like yell at me to say,
Hmm.
"You need to get in line." And before he can open his mouth, I went, "I don't think he's breathing. I need help right now."
Good for you.
And he snaps his finger at the nurse, and she looks at me and says that to her. I've been in this hospital 100 times, and this is the first time I ever did a full run as fast as I could get back to the ER as
Yeah.
I could. So we get into the ER, into the trauma room, and again, I've been in this hospital many times. So I get in this room, I unbuckle him out of his wheelchair, I instinctively put him on the table, and I back out of the way in hope that I can stay in there to watch the
Watch.
because he's nonverbal and I can
Yeah.
tell them what's going on. Luckily, there's another trauma room next to it that's open. The head ER doc goes, just stand over there. I'm gonna come talk to you in a second. Well, as they put him on the table, they immediately cut off all of his clothes. And like I told someone, I did a podcast a while back, and
Hmm.
I told someone, I said, they immediately drilled something like into his bone, like it was like a port or something. And
Hmm.
she said, yes, she said, instead of doing an IV, she said, the fastest way to get something in someone is that way. And I said, the reason why I noticed it was any normal person without anesthesia and you're drilling something
Yes.
into their bone would have
Exactly.
come off that
Yeah.
table
Yeah.
because it would have been excruciatingly painful.
Yeah.
He never flinched.
Yeah.
And so they cut off his clothes. They immediately intubate him, put the tube in him, start getting oxygen in his lungs, and they immediately start CPR on him.
Mm.
So the head ER doc comes over to me and goes, down to the minute, to the best of your recollection, tell me how long he's been this way and why you kind of brought him up here. I did. She goes back in there. She barks orders at him, comes back to me, and she goes, now, what's the scenario as to why you brought him up here? And so I told her everything.
Hmm.
And so she goes, okay. And she goes back and there kind of barks orders at him. Because in pairs of two all the way around him, I can still tell you to this day exactly what every two pairs was doing around him.
Yeah.
And so they're at this point, we're at about 15 or 20 minutes. They're still doing CPR. And then I see them get the paddles out. Traditionally it's the plastic paddles where
Yeah.
they put the gel on it and they go
Yeah.
clear. And
Yeah.
Nowadays it's not that, it's a pad that goes over the heart and the side, and it's almost like an Xbox is what it looks
Yeah.
like, and they press a button and it does its thing. And so they do that, and I'll never forget it. Just like medical dramas, he literally raises off the table. His
Yeah.
body comes up because they shock him. Now, I'd been in this hospital multiple times because of his respiratory thing. So I was watching the monitor to see what his respiratory and his heart rate were doing.
Mhm.
And it, after this moment, it literally went boop and went right back to what it was doing. And in my brain, I go, even though it doesn't fully register, I go, he's not coming back.
Yeah.
I instinctively knew it. And so they continue CPR, and throughout the next 45 minutes,
Wow.
they shock him like 4 or 5 more times.
Yeah.
And it's all the same result. And the head ER doc comes to me and goes, well, we can shock him again. But she said, I don't think it'll produce a different result. And I said, well, I have a lot of medical knowledge as it relates to his respiratory. I said, this is out of my wheelhouse. Do what you think is professionally appropriate. And so they do, nothing happens. And at that point, they pronounce him. So I turn away into this other room and kind of have a moment for a minute or two, and I
Mhm.
regain my composure. I call my wife, who at home at this point still thinks we're going to get admitted.
Yeah.
I will never forget the sound she made when I told her that her son had passed away not an hour from when she last saw him alive.
Mm.
And then after I said, because her parents live close to us, I said, call your parents, have them drive you up. Do not drive yourself.
No.
You're not in a state to do this. And so they do, and they come up, and then I call my mother, and I'll never forget my mother's reaction to it.
Mhm.
And I tell her what's going on. And so I hang up my phone. And at this point, as a man, or yes, as a man, but more so as a man in the special needs world, I've learned very quickly to compartmentalize things because a lot can happen at one time. There have
Mhm.
been many scenarios I've been in where I've had to make split-second decisions to save my son's life or to make phone calls or things like that. So in this moment, I was just like, I've got to compartmentalize this. And so the head of the care team comes up, as they would do anybody that's lost someone there. She goes, I'm sorry for your loss. And I look right at her, and without skipping a beat, I said, this is going to sound harsh and cold. I said, but I have to do this. I need to know information. And I said, I'll deal with this in a minute.
Mhm.
I can see the look in her eyes, like her body language changes when I say that. And I said, I need to know some information. She goes, well, what do you need to know? And I rapid fire like 10 questions off to her. What happens from here? How long is he going to be here? Is he going to be
Yeah.
is he going to get taken to the morgue? When he's in the morgue, are y'all going to do an autopsy? If you do an autopsy, what's the protocol for it? If you don't do an autopsy, what's the protocol for it?
Yeah.
Once the autopsy is decided on, you're going to do it. What's the turnaround time? If it's not, at what point can I talk to a funeral home, and who do I talk to get him home? And I rattle off
You're
all these, and
so male.
yeah, and so because this is what's going to make me feel better in this moment.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I'll deal with the emotion in a minute, but I need to know that because I want to get him home, is
Yeah.
what my thought process is. And so, and she literally takes a step back
Mhm.
and she goes, well, I'm going to talk to the coroner, see what he says. I'll get back to you. I said, okay. So I spend time with my son by myself in there as I'm waiting for his mother to come up. She comes back in and she goes, the coroner's decided he's not going to do an autopsy. And
Mm.
in the moment, I didn't mean for it to come out this way, but I look and I went, why? Why are they not going to do it? I said, I want you to tell me why they're not going to do an autopsy on my son, who just came in here an hour ago, was alive, and is now dead.
Yeah.
And she goes, she goes, well, typically in a children's hospice, she said, there's only a couple of reasons as to why we would do an autopsy. She said, if he were perfectly healthy and he came in here and he died in here for a strange reason, we would do it. If it's criminally related,
Mm.
abuse related, or drug related, we would all do an autopsy on that to figure out the cause of whatever the death was. She said, but because your son has an extensive history with medical needs and
Mm.
issues and all that, they just related it to one of his issues. And I said, okay, I'm fine with that.
Yeah.
And so I just said, I'm going to see a funeral home I think it was, no, it was the next day. I said, tomorrow, who do I need to let them know what's going on? And so she gave me her information, and so we did that. Um, for the longest time, I didn't think I had PTSD from it, but my wife and several other people, based on how I was initially reacting from it, said, "Oh, yeah, you probably
And
do."
that's where I want to take you. Thank you for sharing the whole story because I
Mm.
think a lot of times people just don't understand the journey you've taken.
Oh, yeah.
And you were so descriptive when you saw him lying on the table.
Yeah.
And, you know, PTSD and is something that a lot of people just go, well, I don't have that. I don't.
Yeah.
And why I started the new series, Dirty Moments with Triggers, because this seems to be something that happens to people on a daily. But
Mm,
when you recall looking at that and seeing
mm,
that in that room,
mm.
um, tell me what emotions, like you talk about burying. I often use a jar. I talk
Yeah.
about bottling emotions,
Mm.
and how that jar opens up. And I've had my own story with that. But in sitting and standing there and watching this all take place, um, what was an emotion that, what were you bottling? Was it anger? Was it pissed off? Was it sadness? Like, what was the very first thing that you felt when you could no longer fix what was happening?
It honestly, it was kind of a numbness and a disbelief
Mm,
because for so many years before, I was always the one that I did the medical procedures. I was the one that
yeah,
brought him up here. I was the one that made him feel better. And feeling better in the sense of if only bringing him to the hospital to get him admitted
yeah,
so that the professionals can do their job.
yeah.
And so it was more, again, it was a lot of disbelief in that moment that what in the hell just happened?
Yeah.
And it was a surreal moment going. Now, I will say, as a parent of a child with a chronic or terminal illness, the thought that he may pass away early was always in the back of my mind. I never wanted it to happen, but I knew the combination of issues and the possibilities, everything, it could happen. I
Mm,
never thought it would, but it was always something I always had it stored in the back of my brain.
that it could happen.
So when it actually did happen, it was just disbelief, shock,
Yeah.
just, again, what the hell just happened
And I
here?
think that is, it doesn't matter your sex. That's a human response. Like,
Mhm.
as we first experience these things, grief is the human sorrow of everything, mind, body, spirit. And I
Mm,
think when you're standing there as a human, you're like, holy shit,
mm.
this is
Yep.
happening. This is a movie. And, where I think it sometimes differs is how we respond to it,
Hmm.
where you're like, okay, we have to get this, 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 this. And I often find that men want an understanding of how the person died.
Yeah.
Tell me how. That's where that need for autopsy is. My
Yep.
emotions need to have an answer to this. If I have an answer to this, I think the brain then can digest it better and understand
Yep.
it a little bit better. And
Yep.
thankfully, you were able to grasp that by them
Mm,
saying, well, these are all these medical. So once we're done the funeral and you're done
mm,
figuring out and placing everything where it needs to go, tell me
mm.
when your real first encounter, really, I want to say your real first encounter, because this usually happens when everything goes silent. The funeral is over, you're at home taking care of your
Mm,
other child, and nobody's bringing you a chicken casserole anymore. Nobody is walking through the door saying, hey, how are you? No
mm.
one's going, Jason, are you making it through the day? It's
Uh-huh.
like, shit, here's my coffee first thing in the morning and here's my
Mm.
brain. What
Yep.
what what's the emotion that enters in for you?
Actually, it was that day,
Mm,
the day that he passed away.
mm,
It was before all that.
mm,
I tell people all the time, I'm one of those people that I look for, like with my son, I always notice patterns. And
mm,
it was when the patterns were out of whack is when he got sick.
mm,
And so I trained myself to kind of look for those things.
mm,
And so like that day. as I was sitting up there in the trauma room with him by myself, just talking to him after he had passed, waiting on his mother to come up here. Like I tell people, I said, I noticed how fast he went from his normal temperature just to outright cold.
Mm-hmm.
And that hit me with kind of a gut punch of just how fast that was. The other thing I tell people, outside of the actual passing and things afterwards, I said the hardest thing I ever had to do was he had passed. My wife and her family were up there, and we decided that we were gonna, we had spent our time with him, and we were gonna leave to kind of come home to
Mm-hmm.
process and go to the funeral home, that kind of stuff. I had to take all of his cut off clothes, put it in his empty wheelchair, and walk it through that entire hospital down to the where we were parked.
Mm.
And that was probably the hardest journey I've ever had to take. And then because we were 60 miles north of where we live in Atlanta, that was probably the longest, most silent ride my wife and I have ever had. Then it comes into we got into the house and I walked into his room, which is what I'm sitting in.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it just hit me like a Mack truck. I mean, just it ran me over. The other moment that my daughter, even though she's nonverbal and has developmental delays, she always knew that I was the one to take him to the hospital,
Yep.
stay with him the whole time, and
And bring
come
him
home
back.
with him.
Yeah, exactly.
And so that morning, she knew he was home, but when she came home, even though she couldn't tell me, she had this look of, where is
Something's
Zachary?
different.
And for a long while, and I don't blame her, I felt like she blamed me because I didn't bring him home. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
she doesn't know any different.
That's right.
And so, I mean, that it was a tough pill for me to swallow, but again, I didn't blame her because that's all she knew.
Mm-hmm.
And it was those kind of moments that were just real tough moments, at least right in the beginning.
Yeah.
Um, but, you know, a, a lot of this, in grief and special needs and all that, I learned from very early on in this life that I had to compartmentalize things. I had to detach at least for a little while to do other things to keep my sanity amongst all the madness that was going on. And so that's kind of the plan that I went through when it came to after we came home and going to the
Mm-hmm.
funeral home and making all those decisions. And then, the viewing and the service and, all that kind of stuff. And I also learned people are great and and I say this, I take nothing against other people that came in and gave their condolences. But from someone who's experienced death, or as a parent, one would consider the most devastating thing you can experience,
Mm-hmm.
you see how quickly all the fanfare dies off, if you will.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't expect that. I never expected them to continue bringing me casseroles and food and all
Mm-hmm.
that. But one of the things that was surprising was at least we're a social media world. And so how quickly even the responses online went
Mm-hmm.
from, hey, how's everything going? I just hope you're doing okay, to nothing.
Yeah. Yeah.
In fact, right about a month afterwards, when things kind of died off, at the time on my Facebook page, I had like 300 connections
Mm-hmm.
on there. And I looked at my wife and I said, I was irritated about something. I was angry about something. And I literally dropped everybody but about five people that I knew that I constantly commented with. And I commented to my wife, I said, this is an experiment. I want to see how many people
Good
in
for
my
you.
connections are going to notice that we're disconnected,
Yeah.
message me and say what's going on. And
Mm-hmm.
of those 300 people that I did, four
Yeah. Yeah.
commented back. And
And I
I'm just
think
like,
that's, just to take you back to that compartmentalization, because that is very common in both sexes. Because
mm,
what happens is society is saying, we don't want to talk about this. We don't. Like, even in my career, people are
mm,
nervous when I walk in a room or I attend something and they're like, oh, don't ask her about her career. She's going
mhm,
to talk about death. And
mhm,
it's not what I talk about. I talk about living. And
uh-huh,
it is fascinating how you really kind of have to compartmentalize,
mhm,
because Nobody's going to say, "How are you doing, Jason, after Zach's
Hmm.
death?" Nobody's going to
Yeah.
do this. Why? I don't understand.
Hmm.
They can talk about everything else. One of my biggest beefs, and I know everybody out there hears this every podcast, is we teach our children how to create life. We really
Hmm.
do, but we don't
Hmm.
teach them what to do when that life dies.
Yep.
What if that person you're creating it with dies? What if your sibling dies? What if your baby dies? Nobody,
Mm.
and they throw a thousand different reasons in my face. But just to say death is possible. This is the other
Hmm.
side of life. That's all we need to
Hmm.
say. So somebody has that knowledge or that idea in their head,
Hmm.
but they compartmentalize it. And then we go, okay, now I can deal with all this other stuff, smile and act like I'm okay, because that's what I got to do to make it through the day.
Hmm.
Where, when that bottle breaks and you can't compartmentalize, that's when you wipe out 300 people off your Facebook page and say,
Yep.
here's five that actually friggin' care for me. And,
Yep.
so I can see in you and following you this anger and the frustration. And
Yeah.
then one of my biggest questions is, after this is all settling and you're living this life, when you
Hmm.
get frustrated, do you
Hmm.
find you're quicker to anger? And, is that something? Because there's a lot of times where, from my experience of working with men, it's these level of frustrations and anger. And then all of a sudden we hit the spot
Hmm.
where, you know, it's the emotions come out and we're
Yep.
crying and we're talking, and as a woman, it's beautiful. It's one of those things where you're like, thank you for trusting me with your vulnerability.
Hmm.
But it is extremely hard for
Hmm.
somebody when we listen to your journey, taking care of him, staying home with
Hmm.
him, being the person, the primary caregiver, and then watching him die.
Yep.
How in the world do you bring that vulnerability forward?
Well, I will say before all of this ever happened, I'm a big proponent of therapy.
Hmm.
I was seeing a counselor for about a year before all of this happened.
Good for
To
you.
be quite blunt and honest about it, I dealt with a lot of anger issues just because when my son and my daughter were born, the underlying issue was this wasn't the life we signed up for, and I was angry about it.
Yeah.
Um, which I later found out that that anger was more, it turned out to really be more fear of the unknown than anything. Um, and so I had gone to counseling for about a year, and the irony of all of this was about a week or so before my son actually passed, I'd felt like the season of counseling had run its course. And so
Hmm.
I told my counselor, I said, I think I'm going to stop seeing you for a while. I said, I think this has kind of run its course. And I said, should something come up, I'll schedule another appointment. She's like, that's fine, not a problem. That's kind of how counseling goes. And so no more than I said that, everything happened with my son. And I immediately called her up and said, we got to make an appointment. I've got
Hmm.
some pretty big news to tell you. And so, yeah, anger definitely as a man or as a me in general was probably the first thing that came out. And it wasn't so much shaking my fist anger kind of thing. It was more, I got highly irritated very quickly.
Hmm.
And even in the beginning, my wife would make comments about it, not just look down upon it, just to kind of inform me that,
Hmm.
you seem like you're really irritated today, that kind of thing. And, or like if she asked me what was going on, my simple response was just like, I'm just really irritated at the moment. And I would just kind of leave it at that just because I didn't want to, not so much not open up to her, but because I knew if I got into it, it would just start, I would start get
You would
going with
spiral.
it.
You would
And
spiral.
I didn't want to do that. So, even to this day, about 2.25 years afterwards, I still to this day have made comments before. Things that never used to just bother me just irritate me to no end. And so that's the biggest thing a hurdle I've had to overcome. But in that moment, I mean, there were songs that would come out that may not be grief related songs, but there were sentiments in it that reminded me of my son.
Yeah.
And I'd hear him, and again, it would just hit me like a Mack truck. And I mean, I'd double over, just up, crying and upset. And
And I think
Yeah.
that's the thing with anger is it's a symptom of another emotion.
Yeah.
Where I think that's where people go wrong with anger. They take it directly like that person's angry and they're mad at you. No, it's a
Mm-hmm.
symptom of another emotion.
Yeah.
So if you're feeling great sadness and you don't want to allow that to come forward, because sometimes it
Mm-hmm.
is too hard to allow that to come forward.
Oh
Sometimes
yeah.
the heavy sadness will just take you down
Mm-hmm.
and to a place you don't really want to go. And
Yep.
so that anger steps in to say, "Hey, hey, hey, get your shit together. Let's go."
Yep.
And I think that frustration level comes from somebody who's experienced something beyond belief. So
Yep.
every day I would explain this because in deployment somebody said to me, uh, I was dealing with I was actually a death notificationer for children,
Mm-hmm.
and during 9/11, and this lady says, "You're going to go home and you're going to mow your lawn, and your neighbors are going to come out and they're going to mow their lawn." And I looked at her and she goes, "And you're going to realize what I'm saying." And I went
Mm-hmm.
home and I remember cracking a beer, mowing my lawn.
Mm-hmm.
And as I started mowing my lawn, I went, "Oh my gosh." And I looked sideways and I looked the other way and the grass looked different.
Mm-hmm.
I could smell the grass, I could see the grass. I started crying. And
Mm-hmm.
then I realized I don't give a shit about what I'm eating at 5 o'clock.
Mm-hmm.
And I would go to work and people would say, "So what are you eating at 5 o'clock?" I don't even know if I'm going to be alive at 5 o'clock. Why are
Mm-hmm.
you thinking about dinner?
Mm-hmm.
And then it would be, like your hair or how your makeup looked or what you were wearing that day. And I
Mm-hmm.
realized my perspective of life had just changed drastically. These
Mm-hmm.
people were frustrating the shit out of me. I was
Mm-hmm.
like, you are worrying about the stupidest thing.
Yep.
Be in traffic and somebody's going to get out and punch someone in the face. I'm like, man, like, do you not
Mm-hmm.
realize? And I found that to be frustration for me. But
Yep.
watching men, I was like,
Yep.
oh dear, back up. And they would be,
Yep.
what is that person worrying about? They have no concept of life. So did
Mm-hmm.
you find your frustration was about those type of things? Like, that the world
Yeah.
really was seen differently?
E- it has evolved over time, I will say. Initially, it was a lot of it came with, and it's no fault of the people I was seeing it from,
Yes.
but it
Oh
would be
no.
like parents complaining about something that they've got to do for their kids
Yeah.
or somewhere they've got to go.
Perfect example.
And I wanted to go over there and shake them and go, if you only knew what it would be like if you no
Mm-hmm.
longer had your child to be
Yeah.
able to go and do that with,
Yeah.
or, just arguing about a lot of superficial things that
Yep.
I'm just like, what, what, what bearing does that really have on your life or anybody's life around you?
Yeah.
If it happens, great. If it doesn't, oh well, move on.
Yeah.
And so that's a lot of where my frustration came with, you know, it goes back to that. There's a statement that goes along. I'm sure you probably heard that someone would say, is it a problem or an inconvenience?
Yes. Yes.
And so I would want to go up to them and go, that's not a problem, that's an inconvenience.
Yeah.
A problem is like something you can't that happens that you cannot reverse.
Exactly.
An inconvenience is something that may irritate you that you've got to do that you don't want to do,
Yeah.
but that's not a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's more in all the scenarios I was around that was kind of running through my head. These people, I would just think in my head, y'all are just sitting here complaining about inconveniences, and you're none the wiser to it.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what did you do? And I'm obviously going to um assume it's the letters to Zachary. That's where you
Mhm.
took all these emotions and were able to go, okay, we need to start talking about this. What
Mhm.
was your first concept or idea as to why you needed to bring this to the masses from men?
Well, first of all, it was actually my counselor who commented. She goes, "Have you ever thought about journaling?" And ironically, I went, I don't know if I'm that great of a writer. I don't know if
Mm-hmm.
people really respond to it, something to that effect. And honestly, after she told me that idea sat on my table probably for 8 months.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I didn't touch it for a while. And then just one day out of the blue, I thought, I'm gonna get open a Word document. In letter
Yeah.
form. I'm gonna write what I think in this moment to my son.
Mm.
And no, it may have been earlier than that because some of the first letters were very close to when he passed away.
Mhm.
I did, and I didn't share it for 8 months. And so I just got out there and just, for lack of better ways to say, verbally vomited all over the page is what I did. And initially I wasn't going to share it because it was a personal thing. And it was more for, I needed somewhere to get it out so it wouldn't just
Yeah,
eat me alive from the inside
exactly.
out.
Yep,
And so again, I'm a researcher, so I got on social media and I looked up grief groups.
yep.
And the first group I found was actually a grief group related to people that had lost a special needs child, which
Wow.
I'm surprised I found.
Yeah,
That's a very niche market.
yeah,
And so I got in there, and I got to where in fact, I'm connected with the admin to this day. Got to know her really well.
good.
And I said, at some point, I said, do you mind if I post one of my journal entries? And she goes, no, we'd love for you to. Because as most people know, most of those groups are 95, 96% women. It's
Yep,
about 5% men.
yep,
And then of that 5%, maybe 0.5% are regular posters in there.
yeah,
So I get in there and I post a letter, don't think anything about it. And it gets a massive response immediately. And I get comments to the effect of, like, I had one woman say, you are the first person to write exactly how I feel, that emotions that I have never told anybody. She said, this is
yeah.
to the letter exactly how I feel. You were the first person to do that. And I've always been one to kind of downplay compliments.
Mhm.
I said, well, I appreciate it. I appreciate the kind words. I said, this is kind of what my son's inspired me to write. And, I appreciate the nice thought. So over a period of time, I post letter after letter every couple of weeks. And every time I'm getting this response.
Yeah,
And so, the moderator or the admin goes, have you ever considered writing a book? And I said, at the time, I was just like, I don't have enough material.
yeah,
Whereas now I've got a binder at my feet that's a 2.5 inch binder of stuff that I could probably just post that
yeah,
as a book. And so I went, I don't know if I have enough material. And she said, well, have you thought about doing a podcast? And I went, my brain can't handle that right now. And so she said, and then so she finally goes, well, have you ever thought about doing like a Facebook page? You could do it as like a blog kind of thing. She said,
yeah,
all you really have to do is copy and paste what you're already doing.
yeah,
And so I said, well, that's not a bad idea. And so I did that in the beginning. And like most groups you get in there, I probably had 10 or 12 followers, that kind of
yeah,
thing. And it wasn't really going anywhere. It was more for me to do it. And then just out of the blue, I got this wild hair. I said, I'm going to start emailing some of the people I consider kind of the heavyweights in the group community, people that have written books and,
yep,
have been well known and that are known in the grief community. And I hate to say it this way, but I was shockingly surprised at how friendly and
yeah,
willing to offer up information,
yep,
meaning, like in other industries, they'd be like, "Ooh, you're going to be my competition. I don't
yeah,
want to give you." And
exactly.
they were just like, "No, here." Like I would go in there. There's a lady by the name of Donna Ashworth, based out of Scotland,
Yeah,
that's written multiple books, got like 1.5 million followers,
yeah,
just a massive following to her work. And I emailed her one day and just said, look, my name is so and so. I'm trying to get this off the ground. I think I've got something here. Can you give me pointers as to maybe things I should do, shouldn't do? And she's like, sure. If you're going to go this direction, here's what you kind of need to think about. If you're going to write a book, you may want to make a website,
yeah,
that kind of thing. Just those things I would have never thought about. And so initially, I wrote it for just men because I got, honestly, outside of just getting it out, the other reason why I made the site was out of spite.
yeah.
I mean, I hate to say it that way
There's that nice anger.
because I was so. It's nothing against women and
Mhm.
all that, but I wanted other men, maybe
Mhm.
not exactly what I dealt with, but something similar to it, and I couldn't
Yeah,
find them.
yeah,
And so I made this as kind of a judgment free zone, somewhere you could feel vulnerable. And like, if you get on my page, I've got the first video, I think I stated in there, you can come in here and say whatever you feel, as raw as you want your feelings to be.
Yeah,
My only request in this here is I will not put up with people bashing people over, because you
exactly.
have no idea the scenario that they're going through. Now, if someone's being rude or mean in the way that they're stating it, yeah, I'll
Yeah.
say something to them, but we're not going to do this. And so that's kind of how all that came about. And then it has evolved to where I've opened it up to everybody that has lost
Well,
someone.
and I think that needs to be because when you're in relationships with men
Hmm.
or you have sons, this is, gaining an understanding. It's not always the same. Everybody is different, man, female,
Hmm.
whatever, right? We're
Yeah.
all different, but there are some similarities, and that
Yes.
can kind of help you out. Just going back to how people were reacting to you, I had that with my very first book, Where's Robert? I wrote like it looked like a Bible. And by the
Hmm.
time I was done, it was only a few words on a page.
Hmm.
And I just kind of was able to put it all on paper, puke it out basically into a
Yeah. Yeah.
journal, and then created my book. But the response, hearing from Rosie O'Donnell, David Prowse, who plays Darth
Oh,
Vader.
wow.
Yeah, like I heard from all these famous people. And what I learned about from being deployed and, receiving a certificate of appreciation from Donald H. Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, like
Yep.
I reached people beyond what I was floored. And
Yep.
then I went, oh my goodness, grief is not discriminating. It's the only thing in life that is going to
Yep.
get everyone. So, and you don't choose this career. This career chooses you. It's not
Yep.
like you woke up and said, I have not met one person who has said, I decided I'm going to work in the field of grief just out
Yep.
of random. That's why
Yep.
counselors really don't specialize it. That's why coaches really aren't specialized into it,
Mhm.
but we are now. Now people are
Yep.
going, "Hey, this is the thing that we should be talking about." But I was floored on the response that people have
Yep.
given me. And then I learned I have a form of dyslexia that it doesn't matter if you can't write great. There are so
Mhm.
many different ways that you can work through that
Mhm.
and publish books. Um, so if people wanted to hear or see Letters to Zachary, how would they go about it? I know we're going to put all the links and
The
everything, but
the page itself on Facebook is where I do all my primary.
okay.
That would be letters to the word T-O Zachary, Zachary.
Okay. We'll put the link.
Um, what's that?
We'll put the link with our podcast
Oh,
too. So,
on Facebook, it would be Letters to Zachary. I am also on Twitter or X, Instagram, and TikTok. That's
nice.
Letters to the number two Zachary.
Mm-hmm.
And I only did that because I couldn't get the other way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I typically post on the Facebook page first and kind of transfer everything
Yep.
else over to the other ones to kind of meet all the different areas. Now, TikTok's a little different in the sense of I do more just random grief thoughts on there,
Nice.
that may be different than what I'm doing on Facebook. And
Mm-hmm.
initially, I wasn't on there, but when I ran across Lenny Hunt on TikTok, who's got a huge grief following on there, his comment to me was, "You'd be surprised to know about how big the community for grief is on TikTok."
Yes.
And so I started doing that on there, and I try to do short, less than about 5 minute videos on there,
Mm-hmm.
just about either random moments I'm having or random thoughts I'm having or just questions that I think about or see throughout the day that I want to answer on there to kind of share with everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's more or less what I do there. I do have probably 20 videos on there. I don't have a ton on there,
But
but
I
I'm
think
trying to
that
get better at it.
yeah, and I think that's where your healing is coming into play. Like like you mentioned, 2.5 years out. That's not a long time.
Mm-mm.
I'm 33 years in, and I'm still
Mhm.
doing it.
Mhm.
And you heal, but grief isn't something we get rid of. We integrate it. We integrate it
Yeah.
into who we are. We become better human beings after it.
Mhm.
Sadder and maybe more hurtful, but
Mm.
that pain is so heavy to heal and carry. And I understand that. But I do see another side of people that I'm like, there's that beautiful
Mhm.
person. And that part for you is letters to Zachary and being able to
Mm.
be that vulnerable and share it with others and allow them the
Mhm.
opportunity to check in every once in a while and go, hey, I feel the same way he does.
Mhm.
Um, we're going to put all those links there. And I just want to say thank you for Jason coming here and being with us. Love to hear your comments about this all. There's so much in this episode, such as special needs children,
Mhm.
hearing that news. How did you react? How did you process that information down to watching your child literally die before your eyes? I know a lot of my listeners, and I know a lot of you that are listening right at this moment have experienced something similar. And I want you to know this is a place for you to be safe. This is a place
Mhm.
for you to be able to express yourself. If you want to reach out to Jason, please do. If you want to send us some questions or concerns or thoughts, we're here to hear, we're here to listen.
Mhm.
So until next time, just remember, it is only together that we will heal. Together we grieve and together we heal. Thanks so much, guys. Take care. Grief Uprooted professional grief and empowerment coaching are not to be used as a substitute for professional advice by legal, medical, financial, business, spiritual, or other qualified professionals. All our products and services are designed for grief empowerment through learning and sharing of one's lived experience.